Welcome back to Biteside. I'm Seamus Byrne. This is a show about the digital world that we're all living in these days. And today we're talking about the digital games tax offset. Yes, sounds a little dry, but for years, the games industry has been fighting to get that little bit of assistance from the government that recognises the value and the great creative industry jobs that go with having a really robust Australian games industry. They've often just wanted to be brought into line with the industries like the film industry. And last year, the government introduced this digital games tax offset. And for the most part, it was applauded because that's great. You know, any step forward is a fantastic step forward. So I think I was part of the chorus that just thought, fantastic, we're finally getting somewhere. And no doubt the industry, through its lobbying processes, has also been applauding, the fact that it's a big step forward. On April 18, the window for feedback closes on the nature of the details of this offset that's meant to kick in as of the 1st of July in the new financial year. And I read an interesting piece at a website called Techlever by Ben Thompson. He's an Australian specialist in this R&D tax space for innovation and tech companies and startups and people like that. And he helps those kinds of companies understand the opportunities and helps them to try to save money in those areas. He had a really interesting insight into the detail of the digital games tax offset and a lot of problems that actually exist in the way that the rules have been written. And so he's really trying to encourage more people to have a closer look, understand what's going on, and join in that feedback process and point out what should change to make this as good as it could be for the future of this industry. So having read that piece, I caught up with Ben just to try to get this really quick episode out to get an understanding of what's going on and what people should be keeping in mind about the offsets and specifically the kinds of things that are excluded from the offsets. In a digital industry, the idea that you can't claim things like computer hardware and software and game engines seems like a really kind of weird way to set up. So let's jump into my conversation that I had with Ben Thompson from Techlever, and there's a link to his article in the show notes as well. Let's dive in. It's always great to be able to talk to somebody who has expertise in interpreting these things. And I think as you're just saying, we generally want to welcome these kinds of things to the industry, but it's good to dig into the details so people actually understand what they are or particularly what they might not be getting. So can you kind of explain, just your expertise in this R&D tax space so people know that you know what you're talking about?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Seamus. So I'm Ben and run Techlever, who specialises in the consulting and advice around the research and development tax incentive. It's been in operation now for 10 years, or 10 plus years. And I've been doing R&D tax since 2006. It provides money back to companies who are conducting research and development activities, which aren't necessarily a known quantity. You don't know if it's going to work, and the government incentivizes companies to spend some money because if it comes off, you might turn into Cochlear or ResMed or Atlassian.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's a legislated instrument in the Income Tax Assessment Act, as are other pre-existing film and television offsets, and the digital games tax offset, which is the legislation is for review at the moment, will also live in that Income Tax Assessment Act. And so my experience is broadly applicable in that I live and breathe R&D tax and translating legislation to actual, real world business activities and expenses. And that's transferable across DGTO. So I'm looking at it from I'm poking holes and looking for gaps and things that maybe the industry body, which has been a huge advocate for getting DGTO to where it is today, they might be not seeing it, or I'm just coming at it from a different angle.
Yeah, and look, I think you touched on what seems like a really critical point there, right? Which is that this is meant to encourage people to invest in an area that they might not feel like, is this or isn't this going to work out? And so, from the conversation we had prior to this chat, it seems clear that if a games company suddenly realizes, oh, we can't even claim, some of the key software that we need to be able to produce this game we want to make, or some of the other sort of hard costs of setting up to actually do this stuff, then it's not necessarily actually going to help people in the way they might immediately think when you think, oh, this is what something like this should be able to do.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So the R&D tax, it's about supporting things which are unlikely to work. And there is no requirement for you to be successful or even to roll forward with what you tried. You may revert back to the tried and trusted, boring way of doing things. DGTO, the digital games tax offset, is quite different in that it supports video game development, but you only receive a benefit if you release a game. So you could if a game is not working, or a studio recognizes, this isn't a fun mechanic, or this is just not a enjoyable experience, and they decide to halt production, then they lose. Then they don't get any support through digital games tax offset, let alone what expenses you can and can't claim. Hardware is out. Any software licenses to actually make the game, you can't claim them. Can't claim assets or tools that you may purchase from the asset store, regardless of whether they were made in Australia or otherwise. And most pressingly, and it's only just come to light post-release of the legislation, is that wages paid to co-founders and directors of a company are not claimable under the tax offset. So you could be an indie game dev studio, potentially say 4 co-founders, each of you bringing certain skill set to the team. It could be both developers or creative director, technical director. You can't claim the costs, your wages that you pay to yourself. However, a big AAA studio, they could claim this, the people in the same roles who are most definitely on much larger wages. There's lots of things wrong with it. Hardware and computer costs are kind of fallen into the background as there's inconsistency in not being able to claim that, but the wages to owner directors is another huge problem. It's in front of us. Yeah.
So what is in? I mean, is it basically like the actual wages to staff that are working on that particular thing and not much else?
Yeah, it is interesting. So remuneration for software developers, programmers, engineers, designers, QA, testers, writers, artists, animators, musicians, composers, sound designers, project managers, as long as they're not directors of a company. So it covers everything from research and prototyping of the game through to user testing, updating of the game, obtaining classification, adapting a game to certain platforms. But you need to release the game, and you need to spend at least $500,000 of qualifying expenditure on releasing that game. So it's a bit of a mountain to climb.
It's funny, isn't it? It triggers a thought here that the when we think, because we're always trying to compare in some regards, what does the film industry get when it comes to support versus what does the games industry get? But it sort of hits me that a game studio releasing a bad game, there's almost kind of a much clearer reputational damage in a sense if they then release another game, compared to, if someone puts out a movie and it isn't that great and then the same team of people get together and make another movie, there's always more of that openness to going, oh, well, let's, the other one wasn't that great, but let's see what happens next from those people.
Yeah. Yes. And why there's crappy TV and films which are not so great, it's because they have to also release to get their offset. So it has been a point which the industry, the video game community has pushed back heavily to the government that we don't want to, it's ridiculous to be put in a jam of having to continue with something which you don't want to you want to do, or it's not going to work just to recoup a few bucks. It's madness. But it's, I guess on the flip side, there's nothing currently in the legislation from going down the path of developing the next Fortnite-like game, realizing it's not going to work and go, how about we just put out a solitaire or some sort of match 3 clone with some art, with some ideas from the much larger thing, which is not going ahead, just to scrape things together. But the point taken, the reputational damage is a huge thing in video games. Films and TV have what they're called SPVs, is special purpose vehicles that they get set up to receive funding, to get the DGTO, to get their tax film offsets, which they close down and they start up a new entity for the next thing. Yeah. Video games don't want to, be shutting and closing the thing which they've, nurtured for pour their life into for a number of years. So it is interesting how things have got to the point that they are, that mirror films offsets, but then deviate away to the detriment of video games. Yeah.
I mean, I guess, right, when I look at the sweep of, sort of the history of this sort of stuff, again, it's been a long fight to get much at all. I mean, are there sort of any, positives there compared to, sort of the broader history of this thing? Or like, I guess ultimately we need to be able to engage with, the reality of what is on the table and therefore, argue about, the problems with it while also trying to, encourage progress rather than sort of, have the politicians turn around and take their bat and ball and go home.
I'm approaching this from looking out for the littler people. Overall, it's fantastic that there is support, and if smaller studios can't access it or have to, we're all part of the same ecosystem. So AAA studio comes here, there's going to be more jobs for everyone. People transition in and out of roles and out of jobs. So I mean, right now Australia has such a burgeoning indie scene because the AAA's left after the GFC. So it's the cycle of life. So it's good. And if it brings the big studios here, as is certainly the intent of, or the fact that expenditure has been quite narrow just to labor and nothing else, if that does result in larger studios setting up shop in Australia, then that's a good thing. That's a win for everyone.
Yeah. I mean, as you sort of said at the start, that you've had 15 years of history in this sort of R&D space in general. I mean, have there been any sort of key milestones along the way or anything like that where, it actually felt like some smart levers were put in place, I guess, to, help things along?
I mean, most recently, the R&D tax program has changed to their question structure has changed. It used to be project-centric. Now it's activity-centric to help applicants and let alone the auditors to more quickly hone in on what was actually done and to tick the boxes of eligibility of the activities. So the checks and balances have improved or have gotten more directed with R&D tax, and that's a good thing because you provide a broad and a self-assessed program which is broadly accessible to all industries. The good and the bad turn up and have their hand out going, oh, this sounds like some free money, let me have some. And so putting the screws on a program so only the activities or the companies who you really, I guess it comes back to what's driving the policy, and then does the policy match the program?
Yeah.
R&D tax is good. It's broad enough, and the latest changes have tightened things up to keep things on track. DGTO at this stage doesn't have those same checks and balances based on the legislation as it is at the moment. It's just about expenditure. There is no next step of validating activities against expenditure. Are you developing a game that is ultimately going to be used for sales and marketing purposes? Say digital agencies developing branded games. Branded games themselves aren't eligible for the offset, but can you just take one step back from there being an ineligible game? Like, can you release a sandboxed white labeled product to Steam, and then have subsequent changes to? There's certainly there's loopholes which I can see that the government doesn't seem to be interested in closing them off at this stage, and it's connected to why there is such a restricted, the allowable expenditure. Why there's so many explicit exclusions is because there's a cost of compliance and to the government for people to check this stuff and is it right? And they seem to have tapped out on wanting to do that, and as a result, they've put people on. They've narrowed the focus of what is allowable. The accompanying explanatory statement that was released alongside the legislation gives some insights as to why things are excluded, like hardware. They're like, well, no one makes a hardware in Australia, and so we don't want offsets to be going to AWS for servers, or we don't want money going to Unity or to Unreal. Despite Unreal, Epic having operations here are so even though their reasoning for why things are in or aren't in is logically inconsistent. So back to director salaries or payments to owner directors not being allowable. The reasoning that the Treasury is providing about that is, well, owners and directors, they have undue influence. They control setting their own wages, and that shouldn't be allowable because they will, pay themselves megabucks, inflate their wages just to get a tax offset. On its surface, that sounds, oh yeah, I can understand. That sounds logical. That's not right. You shouldn't allow that. But then you take it a step further, and what are the personal tax rates on compared to company tax rate? So yeah, sure, pay yourself $500,000 and get a 30% offset on that. But the personal tax you'll pay on the $500,000 you'll be paying more tax out of your own personal pocket than what would come back to the company.
You're going to need to be able to generate that revenue at some point to actually pay yourself the money.
Yes, exactly. So the money's either there. The tax man always gets their money. It's just a case of who's handing it over. So, the whole reasoning as to, well, we don't want to claim, you're not allowed to claim director salaries, you're not allowed to claim hardware, or you can't claim licensing. The reasons the government says that's not okay is because it's going to rip off the tax system. But they forget that on the other side, the tax that they'd be collecting from the other people from the other side of the fence.
Yeah.
Regardless of the good or the bad of, well, I agree that DGTO is good, but the inconsistency of what's in and out and the reasoning behind it is what really gets up my nose.
Yeah. Okay. So, people have got about a week left from the time we're recording this to submit to the review. Is there a vague schedule beyond that as to, because I think you're saying it's meant to kick in as of July 1st?
Yeah. So applications for submissions back to Parliament about the draft legislation, the deadline for that is the 18th of April. So the next step after submissions is at some point that the government, as to which government that is, we'll find out after the election.
Yep, sometime at the end of May. Yep.
They will. It will eventually go to a vote, and once it passes in whatever form, it will still come into effect from the 1st of July.
Yep.
So yeah, it's interesting times ahead as to for everyone, let alone for the game dev community as to where this goes. And yeah, the next handful of years we'll start to see how things are going.
No, look, that's awesome. And I will, in the notes for this episode, I'll also throw in the link to your summary of the report, because I think it's definitely helpful for people who don't want to have to wade through actual legislation to have someone like yourself have been able to help to shed a bit of light on it and help people understand it, and I guess ultimately help them to understand what's worth submitting into this review process once they get a clearer read on it, and therefore can see how a better version of this might actually help their organization. So it's really awesome that you've written that up, and fingers crossed that out the other side of this, if enough voices speak up, then a few tweaks could be on the cards.
There's promising signs that there could be some tweaks, certainly around the most pressing issue, which is the director's onus. But thank you very much for having me on. And the other site to keep an eye on is the IGEA website, the industry games body.
No, yeah, thanks a heap. Really, really great to get your insights on that.
Thanks, mate.